One. What is poppin'? It is the slapped, and it is but a lowly slapped in riding these Refi waves. And this is This Week in Refi, where we give you all of the Refi news that is fit to go ape wild over. Of course, with me is the man with the plan, the man with the perpetual summer tan, the Estonian madman, the man of the hour, the man with the power, the man who's so sweet he's never sour, the rug explainer and leader of the regenerative finance vanguard, Sir Rez.
Hello, it's me. I have a screwdriver. I finally found a screwdriver. We can now fix the market.
Let's go. This is good. And, worth noting that we haven't been around for 3 months because you were looking for a screwdriver.
Yeah, the screwdriver did not want to be found, so we skipped an entire season of real life to bring you season 2. Season 2, which will definitely have a very predictable, very understandable release schedule, and we will be here every week, definitely, with no exception, and everything will be fine, and I'm definitely not making promises I can't keep.
I like that, because you don't want to do that, and hey, now that you have that screwdriver, the world is your oyster, and speaking about the world being your oyster, if you're looking for a job that can provide you with the means to purchase multiple screwdrivers, not just one, multiple, boy, do we have a job board for you. RefiJobs.com. It's in the name. Do well and good at the same time. Go get yourself a Refi job. Now's the time. How do you feel about that, Rez?
The best jobs.
The best jobs.
A bunch of layoffs happening in a bunch of sectors right now. So why don't you celebrate by getting a job where you feel better? That's the pitch.
That's right. Google fired you. Hey, go work on Refi.
Yes, go work on Refi in the most abstract sense. You figure out what the actual working on Refi means once you get here.
That's right. They don't tell you. It's a bait and switch. All right.
It's like, hey, do you want to work on Refi? Yes. Okay, we're figuring out what that is in the next 7 months.
Speaking of bait and switches, let's talk about Vera's consultation on third-party crypto instruments and tokens. Now, this happened.
Oh, that's a transition.
This happened a little while ago, and we weren't around because Rez didn't have his screwdriver. But now that he does, we get to talk about this, and this was obviously, I would say, relatively big news, or it should have been anyway. You could make the argument that in some regard it was a nothing burger, because it depends on how you interpret the actual summary of this consultation. And how would you characterize the summary of this consultation?
It's something. It's definitely something. Whether or not it's more than just a something, I can't really say. The main thing I really noticed is that I think they spent about maybe 10 pages really roughly summarizing 150 pages worth of nuance into kind of just these short text blurbs. I feel like they didn't do some points really any justice because of how little space they left for them in their summary. It seemed to be this very neutral, we're going to just summarize everything everybody said with equal weight and not apply too much emphasis on it. It was basically if you put it into Chat GPT and asked, hey, please just summarize the content of what was written, it would probably generate something really similar.
It reminds me of when you have a 10-page minimum on a high school essay, and your job is just to hit that minimum without any synthesis or deep thinking. You're just repeating what you read. And in this page,
paraphrasing, but really short, 2 lines of some people said this thing. I am sure it has meaning to the reader. I'm still figuring out what it says.
Right. So certainly doesn't clarify everything or anything. I do think though that if you were to look at the summary and what was mentioned, and we've said this from the start, that there's probably going to be a level of KYC. That's going to exist in the Refi world that a lot of people are not going to be happy with, particularly retail, right?
Yeah.
Which has always been the chief concern and the chief hurdle to get over. And on one side of the argument, or the wishes of people in retail and refi, are that it should be open and there shouldn't be KYC and anonymity and all these ethos of crypto. And on the other side, Vera, and I'm sure some regulators are saying, well, hey, we have to make sure that it's on the up and up, there's no malfeasance, and we also want to maintain, to some degree, control over these markets.
Yeah. I can even give like a bit of a more detailed perspective, since we've discussed this topic so much in like previous episodes. From the registry's perspective, they have a couple of problems. One of them is what happens if retailers get sold credits, and then The Guardian writes an article about how retail is buying low quality credits, and then it's somehow like, circularly Vera's fault immediately for like allowing low quality credits to exist. And then this is essentially like another vector that Vera can get criticized through. So obviously that's not necessarily a very good thing, especially since these markets are quite new. The second element here is if you're talking with governments, because you would like your voluntary carbon scheme to get included in the local offsetting scheme, like in Australia, we'll also come back to that in a bit, then you need to be a trusted standard, and having like a bunch of these like very explicit, super loud affiliations with crypto might not work with some government officials who have very strong suspicions about crypto. And I guess the last thing is, what happens if securities law or whatever changes, and now Vera is facilitating some sort of like a securities fraud kind of situation? I don't know how realistic that is, but it's just something to consider, that if you are like this international registry trying to operate in literally all countries almost at the same time, you'll have like some local legal implications, and it's not super obvious, I guess, from their perspective of how implicated do they end up being from how their stuff gets used.
Yeah, I think you and I have always taken the perspective of the level of KYC is going to make people uncomfortable, but it's not necessarily unreasonable for Vera to want to do this. There are very, very clear reasons why they should want to do that, and you laid them out. I think it's important that people in the space understand the perspective of somebody like Vera, or like a person, I should say something like Vera, right?
Yeah.
Because it's unreasonable to say, well, we want this and this is our ethos, so we should get it. And it's like everything you had just mentioned is actually super important. And so you had, one of the things you brought up was the a Guardian article.
Yes.
And that's not just hypothetical, because that actually happened. We had a Guardian article come out, I think mid-January or end of January, that took aim at Red Plus credits, took aim at carbon accounting and Vera by proxy. And Vera responded by saying, hey, your accounting of our accounting was not correct. So basically, the Guardian said your accounting is lacking, and then Vera said your accounting of our accounting is lacking. And after reading both their report and the rebuttal, my opinion is everybody's accounting is lacking. What do you say to that?
Obviously, yeah. We're working in like, I think, a very complex area where there aren't a lot of really good answers. When it comes to Red Plus, reminding all of the audience what Red Plus is, since season 2. Red Plus is a sort of forest conservation credit where you are getting carbon credits generally from the virtue of having a rainforest and then making sure it doesn't get chopped down. So usually it has like some additional element of actually benefiting the local community. And it's a sort of do mostly not that much, maybe distribute funds locally, that would be nice. And as long as this rainforest is here and you can prove that it might not be here, if you didn't, own this land and declare like, no chopping, no nothing here, that's how you get credits. So you get credits from the virtue of the rainforest that this project is associated with not getting shut down. That's it.
Right. And so the obvious challenge of that is proving that it would have been chopped down in the absence of some intervention. right? You're
Yes.
proving something that doesn't happen.
Yeah, you're proving that in a alternate reality, this rainforest wouldn't exist. That's
Right.
kind of the logic
So
here.
there's going to be obvious problems with this. It's not going to be 100%
Yeah.
100% accurate. I mean, you can argue infinitely about what could have happened had the intervention not taken place. So the Guardian found that there was really poor accounting, and then they had made some claim. I forget exactly the numbers, but it was like, what was it?
They looked at only like a couple of projects and then like ended up with this kind of very outrageous number of, like I don't know, 90% of carbon
90%, yeah.
credits are basically hot air
Yeah,
or
yeah.
something like this.
It was a lot, yeah. And then Vera said,
Yeah.
well, you didn't look at the proper, parameters, and there's probably, I think they said there's probably some, but it's not as much as you said. And we'll never know, to be perfectly honest. It's a matter of opinion, to honestly. But then you get, we were talking about this, you brought this to my attention, which is this new story on carbon colonialism. And this certainly doesn't do Vera any favors, and it certainly does back up the claims of the Guardian. What would you like to explain about carbon colonialism? This article that came out.
Yeah. It's a pretty good article, honestly, and there's an accompanying 40-minute documentary if anybody wants to check out. So this was ABC. They went on the ground in Papua New Guinea in a to a carbon project called the Night Project. I believe it's called. Which in an area of Papua New Guinea is running a Red Plus project and then is selling got these credits Vera certified and then sold them to a bunch of places. The issue was well, there were a lot of issues. The first really cool, very interesting highlight was that the CEO of the organization that was running this project was charged in the US with securities fraud for doing like Wolf of Wall Street style penny stock sales. At some point, the article claims that he got deported and banned from Papua New Guinea for 2 years. There was a deforestation actively happening in the area that was like the project area, and the project proponent basically just didn't even want to admit that it had happened. And then at some point they were like, oh yeah, we're stopping them now. Like we stopped successfully 2 logging operations in this area. They went to the locals to explain what they're doing and forgot to bring slides because they didn't have a projector, if I remember correctly. So they gave people pamphlets with text explaining how the whole carbon project is supposed to work. But most of the locals can't read, so that wasn't like incredibly useful. Then we had them enter into like a contract, which was, you allow us to run this Red Plus project around your area. It's going to be fantastic, and you are going to get 56% of the proceeds. 50% of the gross revenue is going to go to you. That was the claim. And then they used the loophole in the contract to essentially take all of the money out of the project, or a substantial amount, it seems. Yeah, the locals didn't really get much out of it. At some point, they tried building a schoolhouse. It was burned down by angry locals. Kind of a mess all around, and then the question ends up being, if there is like an active logging operation, if the locals who you are claiming to benefit don't really like you, if there's like so much resistance to it on the ground and everybody is displeased, then how did these credits get certified? That ends up being the question. And I think this is the last mile that ABC didn't do. If you go to Vera and actually read the verification, this like validation document. They essentially, the VVB, this organization that confirms that Vera's methodology was followed and that everything looks good, essentially this verification was done at the start of Corona or around that area, and they actually never went on the ground, so like no locals talked to in this very community-facing project. That's essentially, I think, heavily contributed to how we got into this situation particularly.
When you were explaining all that and you mentioned they built a school and the locals burnt it down, I wanted to say, and then everyone got together and went, ta-da, this is carbon. Yeah, these are carbon credits. It's just a comedy of errors. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, don't want to represent all of carbon accounting to look like this, but these are, like as you said, these are the things that critics and people that have a vested interest in tearing down this movement will look at. And I do think it has like, oh, obviously not just for that reason, but for the reason of doing the right thing, this should be cleaned up. Then the question becomes like, well, how do we, right?
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
do we find ourselves in a situation where this is even possible? And then how do we prevent this? And I don't know if you have any really good answers for that. I certainly don't. I just
Uh,
think it's the nature of the beast we're in right now, right? Without any like enforcement,
mhm.
um, it's going to
Yeah.
be what it is.
Yeah, I think offsetting schemes getting more integrated into actual law would be quite nice. I mean, there's like so little punishment or oversight for doing things wrongly right now that, the tendency is that it's easier to do the wrong thing. But also, when we're talking about all of this, and I generally want to like start all criticism about the carbon markets in this way of like flaws are pointed out to be improved, not stopped. It should be more shameful to do nothing. It's easier and safer to do absolutely nothing instead of trying. So we have to be mindful of this. This is like in a lot of ways some of the things that we're talking about can be improved, and falling short is still better than doing nothing. But last element of this, that the people and organizations who act in bad faith can go eat shit. Like that's that's the disclaimer, right? I mean, if you're really in this market and you're doing bad faith stuff, please leave. Nobody wants you here. We will be happy if you didn't exist. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good point.
And sometimes we just talk about like bad faith people getting away with bad faith things, and that's painful because there's not a lot of enforcement mechanisms that can like punish them for doing this. Even
Yeah, and I
I
think
mean, the worst Vera could do, which they did, was they froze this project proponent's Vera account and said like, "Hey, you can't issue credits anymore." That's it. Like, that's the extent of what they can do.
right, because they didn't technically. Well, I don't know if they broke a law. It doesn't sound like they broke a law. It sounds like they broke some international contract, right, with illiterate people. That like it's difficult to bring like any legal bearing on this. I mean, I guess the people at Papua New Guinea could bring them into a lawsuit, but like I said, they're disadvantaged is the right word, right? It's going to be
Yeah.
difficult. They don't have the resources,
I
presumably, to
mean,
do that.
I think the government could probably do something. I don't know what the something is shaped like. I'm not an expert in Papua New Guinea law.
You're not?
But no, sadly not. But you can always do something. It's just that I wish we had more kind of scrutiny when it comes to project quality, and this scrutiny should start early, not be 10 years later going, what the fuck.
Oh yeah,
like
reactive instead of proactive. That's always the way,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Like, build better systems that actually detect these things early and then punish them for it. Right? Like if you let the project go on for 10 years and then you go like, oh hey, we have a problem, that's I feel there's something wrong with that process.
Right. And I think, Vera freezing their account is the right move. I think that's a lot of times that's just simply the response, right? Sometimes in Vera doesn't do that, where there's obvious problems and they don't they allow these credits to exist and be traded, and then they get upset when they end up on chain, and then they say, well, blockchain is making us look bad. It's like, no, you just didn't handle your problem, So it's just accountability all around, right? Like everybody has to take accountability, including Vera. If shit goes wrong, pardon my French, like just admit it, freeze the account, don't allow the credits to be in the marketplace, and learn from it. Just don't compound
Yeah.
or the
Yeah,
bad
I
actors'
mean,
choices.
doubling down
Yeah,
isn't good either. But it is like I think important to mention that even when we're talking about Vera, things are seemingly getting better. Vera is working on a new updated Red Plus methodology. that is a bit more neutral in terms of the counterfactual. So the arguments that you use to show that the baseline is supposed to be something and that the project is actually creating improvements, that's going to be a bit more data oriented instead of counterfactual argument oriented. So, looking at regional deforestation rates, things like this.
Right. Good. All right. Well, that's bad faith. We have good faith actors. Happy to report this. Senkin start sale of world's first carbon forward tokens, an area that's right in your wheelhouse, Cerez. Know that
Yes.
you and Solid World are all about carbon forwards. What can you tell us about this?
We love forward contracts. Blinder is a near and dear friend to us. They're in the space. They do interesting things. One of the collaborations they had recently was with Senken. Senken, by the way, congrats on, I think, raising around like $7 million. Very, very good at fundraising, it seems. So I'm excited to see what's going to come out of that. But forward contracts, they launched this one sale of 500 carbon credits, forward carbon credits from a project in Kenya called Papriko, which means butterfly in Swahili, I believe. Oh my god, I hope I'm not
It's
wrong
okay.
with this.
I mean, you don't have to know everything.
Yeah, but Papriko, the logic there is that vlinder is butterfly in Dutch, so there's that relationship.
That's cool.
But yeah, they managed to list it. Half of the 500 credits that they were selling have been sold. If you would like some Vera forwards for that are getting issued in 2026, you can do it through Senken, so that's cool.
Very cool. And worth mentioning, I know it's a topic that you love explaining. What's the difference between a future and a forward?
Well, the thing is, terms are very loose in unregulated carbon land. But generally, what the difference is that when you're talking about a future can be this kind of obligation to pay at settlement. So you lock in some sort of a price, and then you are supposed to pay this price at some fixed date. There's a bunch of like collateral in the background to make sure that you can actually pay this. And then finally, on the day where the contract is supposed to be executed, you pay and you get something in return, futures contract. So when we're talking about like forward purchases, they are more in the style of you pay 100% upfront. This is kind of like more of like a pre-purchase agreement, and that means that this is not an obligation to pay. This is a right to receive delivery. So it doesn't require all of the fancy magic that you need to make a futures exchange work. Is the first part of it. The second part of it is if you pay money up front, the project actually has the money that they need to deliver on the project that they're doing, which is important.
Yeah, I think maybe an analog to think about the difference. I'm trying to think of things that get pre-purchased in today's world. One of the there's a big pre-purchase market actually like on video games. People will, because there's like a certain number of copies or whatever, or you get some extra content if you download it early. So you can purchase the video game before it launches. You've already committed your money. You're guaranteed the delivery when it comes your way. Versus, I think a future would be more like you get on a list to have the option to purchase a video game in the future, which isn't a perfect analog, but I think it's pretty close, right? Because you do need a piece of collateral on futures, which you wouldn't need like on getting on a list. But very cool stuff, man.
Futures are essentially, a futures is a more complicated thing to execute. It has a lot of surrounding regulation because you can manipulate the futures market if you are the exchange. There's a lot of stuff around this that makes it a kind of like a potential landmine and why regulation exists for them. But when we're talking about like pre-purchase contracts, it's
Right. It's just the time at which the money is exchanged is forward, It's much earlier than typical transactions. That's really it. There you go.
Mm.
All right. So that's a good story. Here's another good story. Ethereum energy consumption drops to 99.9% post-merge.
Bullish.
Very, right?
I just love this small piece of news. It makes me happy. Blockchain has historically had this really strange connection with energy consumption, which is fair because Bitcoin does require a lot of energy to keep running. For a long time, Ethereum used a very similar mechanism to Bitcoin, so therefore it also had like very large energy consumption. And now there's basically like a small country's worth of energy that is simply not being consumed anymore,
Right.
because of the proof of stake transition.
Right. And so this is obviously bullish for crypto. It's also bullish for Refi. So if you want to build something on Polygon, which checkpointed on Ethereum, now the energy footprint of that would be even smaller, as an example. Or if you want to build directly on Ethereum, the energy footprint, and that's one, I would say, one more arrow out of the ammunition of the naysayers and the people that don't want to see this happen, right? Because that was a big source of FUD was, well, how are you going to save the planet with your Refi if you're building on these energy intensive blockchains? And now it's like, well, one of the biggest blockchains that most people are building on uses literally a minuscule fraction of what it once did, right? You had mentioned Bitcoin, proof of stake. I got to shout out Tiru, a fellow Estonian. Also Litecoin, proof of stake, proof of work. A lot of people don't talk about Litecoin, Rez. Still proof of work.
Yes, truly the silver to Bitcoin's gold.
Good story there. Want to get into this one? This one's going to be juicy. So, a little bit political, a little bit economic. Operation Chokepoint 2.0 is underway, and crypto is in its crosshairs. So, before we get into what Operation Chokepoint 2.0 is, you and I were discussing what Operation Chokepoint 1.0 was. I believe it was 2014, and it was an operation by some regulators in the United States, some regulatory bodies, to unbank any sector or activity that it deemed to be risky or illegal outside the bounds of legality. And so we were going over the things that were to be debanked, and that include things like fireworks sale. That included things like firearm sales, credit card. I mean, the list was extensive, right? And many
pawn shops, tobacco sales, lottery sales, drug paraphernalia, coin dealers, cable box descramblers.
Yes, the illicit
payday
world.
Loans, government grants.
And you may hear that list and you go, yeah, well, like many of those are shady, but the effort was to not allow banking access to entities in these spaces.
This was actually done also really indirectly. I have to emphasize this. So the mission was, hey, let's reduce a lot of this high risk behavior. And how are we going to do it? Are we going to do it through legislation? Are we going to do it through laws?
No.
And then it's like, no, actually, we can just, as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, so these are the people who make sure that you get paid in case there's a bank run for a bank, that's where the US's $100,000, I believe it's $100,000, correct me if I'm wrong, insurance comes from.
You're right.
That normal, retail people wouldn't have to stand in line at a bank if they see that there's a long line at a bank because they're worried that all of the cash might be gone if they don't stand in the line, right? Now, the way that Operation Chokepoint made high-risk activities unbankable was that they raised the insurance premiums for the banks if they serviced these kind of organizations. So they essentially just created a new tax on high-risk activities using this kind of insurance mechanism.
Right. So it's, what's the term? Like regulation without legislation, it's, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. You're supposed to pass laws, and those laws are supposed to be applicable. If you have these bureaucratic agencies, these non-elected bureaucrats who are essentially able to dictate the course of entire industries and sectors That's not the proper channels, but we're doing it anyway. And so now crypto is in the crosshairs, and it's pretty straightforward. If you're these give me an example. Exchanges, right? They need banks to service their customers and their deposits and all that. So if you take the banks away from these crypto exchanges, then they can't operate, right? And you've just killed them without any law, or at least hampered them.
Oh yeah, there's we're finding out that there's a bunch of very interesting ways to hamper organizations. I think one of the interesting things that we saw was, for example, the Binance BUSD investigation announcement rumor thing, which was essentially, hey, we're taking a look at Paxos, the BUSD organization that creates BUSD on behalf or branded with like the Binance USD thing, and we're not announcing any that they did anything wrong. We're not saying any of this. We are just saying that, hey, we're looking into it. And by looking into it, they caused essentially something to the tune of a what was it? $10 billion bank run on BUSD.
26%
in
of
a
the
couple
supply.
of weeks.
26% of BSG circulating supply has dipped, which is completely insane. Just based on that, just on the announcement of a investigation with no details.
Yep.
Right. And so that, in addition to, there was an attempt to, no, it was successful, to remove SWIFT, I believe, from the U.S. What was it, from Binance's U.S. Arm? So SWIFT is the way that funds get moved.
So Binance has this banking collaborator called Signature Bank. It's one of the two only banks in the US that are like major servicers of the crypto industry. One of them is Signature, and the other one of them is Silvergate.
That's right.
And one is currently, I think, being sued because of their relationship with FTX and Alameda, and that one is Silvergate. And then there's Signature Bank, who is kind of getting caught in the same kind of crossfire.
Right. So another way, and it reminds me a lot of Choke Point, right? Where they're taking away the banking. They're putting pressure on the banking. And then that's the way you can cut the legs out from an entity or a sector. So
yeah, you keep making it progressively harder and harder and harder to integrate with the rest of the economy. And then you end up with this question of, hey, are you doing this because you want to avoid contagion with the rest of, the economy? Because we have seen billions go off of crypto market caps, and it doesn't really seem like traditional economies are significantly affected, surprisingly enough. Like, the contagion seems to be more contained than would be usual for financial institutions, for example.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because you see, like Terra, as an example, was a pretty big blow up. FTX was a pretty big blow up, and you didn't see a collapse of, worldwide economic systems, which is interesting. And you could theorize on that. Maybe it's the case that these people were always risk on. They just moved their risk on from like penny stocks, as you had mentioned before, to something like crypto, right? So maybe there's this always element of people essentially gambling in securities and investments, and it just happened to be crypto this time around, and this actually happens more than we realize. Something to that effect. Or maybe it's just not enough money to move the needle. But interesting to see, and definitely something to keep an eye on, and also relevant to Refi, relevant to all of crypto, because it shows that if we don't have, I don't know how to put it, the consent, the assent, the cooperation of the regulators. If we don't have the regulators in good faith working in these sectors, you can face challenges. So last thing we'll bring up, speaking of bad faith, is Gary Gensler. Just the name Gary Gensler. Right. If you're following regulation and following crypto over the years, you know that Gary Gensler is synonymous with bad faith. So Gary Gensler, a lot of things going on with him. He recently reiterated something in an article about what's a security and what's not. And I'm going to quote it. Everything other than Bitcoin, Gensler told me, you can find a website, you can find a group of entrepreneurs. They might set up their legal entities in a tax haven offshore. They might have a foundation. They might lawyer it up to try to arbitrage and make it hard jurisdictionally or so forth. In other words, there are people behind these cryptocurrencies using a variety of complex and legally opaque mechanisms, but at the most basic level, they are trying to promote their tokens and entice investors. So what Gary Gensler is getting at is everything other than Bitcoin is a security. And he very well could be right, as much as this infuriates me and other people, because the opaque and broad nature of the security laws in America, which you and I were discussing, virtually anything can be considered a security. And I think this is intentional because at the end of the day, if everything is under the purview of the SEC, they can pick and choose. And that's exactly the position they want to be in.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, yeah, exactly. It theoretically is the SEC's job to create clarity around these questions, and they're just kind of not doing that, and instead doing this kind of nice cooperation with Web3 people, where you as a crypto project might go up to Mr. Gary Gensler or the SEC and then say, hey, I would like some advice. I would like to do all of these things really nicely. I would want to do it by the book. And then Gary Gensler asks you, hey, okay, so what have you done so far? And you tell them that, hey, well, we raised a bit of money to get all of this legal opinion stuff worked out. And then the next response is, oh, so you sold an unregistered security to a bunch of people? Cool, we're going to sue you now. And then you go to court instead of getting advice, which is fantastic. So, and then people have this argument of okay, why don't you do registered securities as crypto then? And the answer to that is every time you update your code, you have to do a new security offering. That's how the current interpretation works. So that's fun. Also, your code kind of it gets really problematic in a bunch of interesting dimensions because of this, and resubmitting all of this registration stuff also takes a couple of months, so that basically means that you are spending infinite money and time trying to update code, which is fun and definitely makes a bunch of sense.
Right. So not to say that this is what Solid World is doing, but somebody like Solid World could very well just avoid the US, right? It's just not worth it because the crosshairs, if Gary Gensler decides that he's going to put you in his crosshairs, it's going to be a problem, right? So why open yourself up to that? Just avoid the US. And so the argument is that Gary Gensler and the SEC are going to put the United States behind in the world in this sort of innovation and crypto in general, which you might care if you're United States citizens. You might care in general, right? Because you want to see resources and as many people and as many markets have access to this as possible. So unfortunate, but I think it's relevant to Refi because, in theory, if you're operating in the United States, you have to worry about this if you're offering tokens in Refi, just like anybody else would in crypto. So.
Yeah, exactly. The US, especially when dealing with retail, it's a legal landmine. It's the most likely source of litigation against you. It's just kind of this risky territory where at the same time there's a bunch of opportunity, but there's absolutely no rules. But also there are rules, they're just not written down, and also they're not written down, you just get sued. That's kind of the system.
We're number one. We're number one. Hey, happy Estonian Independence Day, by the way. A few days late.
Thank you.
Yes. I heard that from Tiru, actually, that you guys eat fish, drink vodka, and go into saunas. Did you do all of those things?
I had a housewarming party instead. I recently moved apartments, as we saw, we can see in the background. And now I have a home office space, which essentially just means I get to realize what my work-life balance is even more than usual because I don't really leave this room.
I hear you, brother. What's work-life balance anyway?
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, happy to be back doing this. I feel like we covered a lot of ground. You were sharp as always. You haven't missed a beat. I'll try to keep up with you next time.
All right. Very fun.
Any final words?
Yes. I have this like emotional support cat over here, which I will attempt to show you guys.
Look at him.
Yes.
What's his name?
His name is
Boots?
Muffin.
Muffin.
Muffin is a real cutie. I don't think he liked that. He's leaving now. But yes, he was my emotional support void for this brief podcast episode we just had.
Very excited for that. All right, man. Remember, everybody, ape responsibly, would you? We'll catch you all on the next one. Peace, dudes.
Peace.
And dudettes.